It was late September of 2013 when I decided to drive up to a small cabin in northern Arizona, somewhere between Winslow and the Navajo Nation border. I had taken a week off work, wanting to spend some quiet time away from people, away from noise, and away from the city. The cabin belonged to a friend of my father's, an old man who used it for hunting during the colder months. It had no phone signal, no electricity, and only a small wood stove for heat. That was exactly what I wanted: silence and isolation. The drive up there took most of the afternoon. The road started smooth and easy but got worse the farther I went. It turned into dirt, full of loose gravel and narrow turns that seemed endless. Tall pine trees closed in from both sides, their tops bending slightly from the wind. The air got colder as I climbed higher into the hills. The sun was already dipping low when I reached the cabin, a small one-story place made of weathered logs and a tin roof that looked almost rusted through. There was an old shed behind it and a small outhouse 20 yards off to the right. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out of the truck was how quiet it was. There wasn't a single sound. No wind, no birds, not even the hum of insects, just complete stillness. I remember standing there for a while, just listening. It felt strange, almost heavy, like the air itself was pressing down. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. The floor creaked under my boots. There was one main room with a bed, a table, a stove, and a few shelves filled with old cans of beans and coffee. I unpacked my duffel bag, started a small fire in the stove, and sat down. For the first few hours, everything felt peaceful. I could hear the fire crackle, the sound of my own breathing, and nothing else. By the time darkness settled, the silence started to feel different. Not peaceful anymore, just unnatural. I remember stepping outside before bed to get some air. The temperature had dropped sharply, and I could see my breath. The moonlight barely touched the ground through the trees, but I could see the outlines of the forest around the cabin. I didn't hear anything moving. No owls, no coyotes, no crickets. Just the wind brushing through the branches once in a while. I locked the door when I came back inside. It wasn't because I was scared. At least that's what I told myself. But something about the emptiness outside made me uneasy. Sometime past midnight, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. The fire had burned down, and the cabin was almost completely dark except for the dim red glow of coals. Then I heard it, a noise outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint sound, like slow footsteps in the dirt. At first, I thought maybe it was an animal. I listened carefully, holding my breath. The steps were steady, not quick like a deer or skittish like a raccoon. It sounded heavier. The sound moved past the side of the cabin, circling it slowly. Each crunch of dirt came one at a time, measured and deliberate. I sat completely still on the bed, staring toward the door. The footsteps stopped near the front wall, maybe 10 feet away from where I sat. Then nothing, just silence again. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I convinced myself it could have been the wind or maybe my imagination. After half an hour, I laid back down and tried to sleep again, though I didn't really sleep much. In the morning, I went outside. The air was cold, and there was dew on the ground. I checked around the cabin and saw footprints. Large ones, not like boots or shoes, bare feet. They were clear as day in the dirt, the toes and the heel marks visible. Whoever or whatever it was had walked around the cabin and stopped near the window before heading toward the trees. That's when I started to feel real unease. I told myself it might have been someone from a nearby ranch or maybe a hiker who got lost. But deep down, it didn't feel right. I hadn't seen another person since I'd driven off the main road, and there were no tire tracks except mine. The rest of the day, I tried to distract myself. Chopped some wood, boiled water, cleaned up the inside. Still, every now and then, I'd find myself glancing toward the tree line. The forest seemed darker than it had yesterday. That night, I decided to stay up a bit longer. I kept the fire going and sat at the table with my flashlight beside me. Hours passed without any sound. Then, just when I was starting to doze off, I heard it again. Footsteps, same as before, slow and heavy, circling. My heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I turned off the lantern, hoping to hear better. The footsteps stopped right outside the window. I could hear shallow breathing, low, rough, and uneven. I didn't move, not a single muscle. I just sat there staring into the dark window, knowing someone or something was standing on the other side of it. After what felt like forever, the breathing faded, and the steps moved away again. When I finally got the courage to look outside with the flashlight, there was nothing there, just the trees and the dark. I stayed awake until dawn that night. The next morning, I walked out to the trees where the footprints had led. The ground was disturbed again, and there were new prints, the same bare feet, but deeper this time, like whoever it was had been running or stomping hard. They went deeper into the woods, far from the cabin. I followed them for maybe 100 yards before I stopped. I didn't like how quiet it was. The air felt thick, and I had the feeling I was being watched. That evening, clouds rolled in. The sky turned gray, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees. I stayed inside most of the day, sitting near the stove. I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. I kept replaying the sound of the breathing outside the window. When darkness came again, I felt tense. I didn't want to turn off the lantern, but the fuel was running low. I kept the flashlight close. Sometime around midnight, I heard something hit the side of the cabin. A dull thud, then another, like someone throwing rocks. My hands were shaking. I grabbed the flashlight, but before I could stand, there was a scraping sound on the wall, like nails dragging across the wood. I didn't move. I just listened. The scraping went from one end of the wall to the other, slow and steady. Then I heard footsteps again, this time moving toward the door. The doorknob rattled softly at first, then harder. I backed away, holding the flashlight tight. The sound stopped. The wind outside died down. I stood there for several minutes, waiting. Then came one more sound, low and deep, almost like a human groan, but not quite right. It lasted only a second and then disappeared into the wind. I didn't sleep at all that night. By sunrise, I made up my mind to leave. I packed my things, loaded them into the truck, and took one last look around. There were more prints near the cabin, scattered and uneven, circling again. Some of them were fresh. The drive back down the mountain was slow. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. When I finally reached town, I pulled into a gas station and looked at the back of my truck. The rear bumper had long scratches across it, deep, ragged lines like someone had dragged metal along it during the night. I never went back to that cabin. Later, I asked around about that area. The man who owned the cabin told me there were stories, not about ghosts or anything supernatural, but about people who lived way out there, off the land, completely cut off from everyone. Some of them were said to wander the woods at night, wearing animal hides, mimicking sounds, watching trespassers from the tree lines. I don't know if that's what I saw or what was outside that cabin, but the memory still makes my stomach tighten. Sometimes, when I think back to that night, I can still hear the slow scrape of nails across the wall and the sound of heavy breathing just beyond the window. And every time I drive through that part of Arizona, I keep my eyes away from the tree line, just in case something's still out there watching. It happened in late October of 2017. I was 32 at the time, working a delivery route through the backcountry in northern Montana. My job usually kept me close to the towns, but that day my boss had sent me out on a longer run. delivering some replacement parts to a small forestry station that sat deep beyond the logging roads. I didn't mind the quiet drives. In fact, I liked them. I usually kept a thermos of coffee with me and listened to the hum of the truck and the sound of gravel under the tires. But that day, the quiet started to feel heavy around noon when the clouds rolled in. The sky turned the color of dirty steel, and I realized how far I was from anyone else. By the time I finished the drop-off, a light drizzle had started. I turned the truck around and began heading back toward the highway, which was about 30 miles away. The forest looked endless on both sides. Tall pines packed together so tightly that the ground below them looked black. My GPS had lost signal hours earlier, and I had been relying on a paper map that was starting to smudge from damp hands. I wasn't worried at first, but around 3 p.m., the rain started to get heavier. About 20 minutes later, the truck made a strange popping noise. I slowed down and pressed the gas again, but the engine sputtered. I pulled over to the side of the dirt road and lifted the hood. Steam hissed out, and a faint burnt smell came from the radiator. The engine had overheated. I didn't have cell service, and I hadn't seen another vehicle since morning. My best option was to wait a bit, let the truck cool, and try again. I sat there for almost an hour, listening to the rain hit the windshield and the faint sound of branches creaking in the wind. When I tried to start it again, nothing happened. The battery had died completely. The sky was dimming fast, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. I knew it wasn't smart to stay in the truck overnight. It would get cold enough to freeze. I looked around and saw an old dirt path leading deeper into the woods, maybe wide enough for an ATV. It wasn't marked on the map, but I thought maybe it led to a cabin or another logging site. I grabbed my flashlight, zipped up my jacket, and started walking. The mud was slick under my boots, and the rain came in steady sheets. The sound of it drowned out everything else, even the crunch of my steps. After about 20 minutes, the path narrowed and curved uphill. My flashlight flickered once, then steadied. I tried not to think about the fact that I had no backup batteries. My fingers were starting to go numb from the cold. Just when I began to think I should turn back, I saw something ahead through the trees, a faint square shape. As I got closer, I realized it was a cabin. It looked old but not completely abandoned. The roof sagged a little on one side, and the porch was half covered in leaves. There were a few rusted tools leaning against the outer wall, and a metal bucket filled with rainwater sat beside the steps. The door was shut but not locked. I pushed it open, and the hinges gave a long, slow groan. Inside, the air was damp and stale. It smelled like wet wood and something faintly metallic, maybe old nails or rust. The cabin had one main room and a smaller section toward the back that might have been a sleeping area. The furniture was minimal: a small table, 2 chairs, and a wood stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There were cobwebs in the corners, but it wasn't completely filthy. Someone might have used it occasionally. I shut the door behind me to block out the wind and used my flashlight to scan the place more closely. There was an old blanket folded on the table, stiff from moisture, and a few cans on a shelf near the back. The labels were faded, but one still read beans. I didn't open anything. I just sat on the floor near the stove and tried to warm my hands with my breath. The rain outside had turned into a steady drumming against the roof, and the light through the windows dimmed until it was nearly black inside. At some point, I must have dozed off sitting there. When I opened my eyes, it was pitch dark except for the thin beam of my flashlight. I checked my watch. It was close to midnight. The air had grown colder, and the wind was howling outside hard enough to make the cabin creak. I could hear something tapping near the back wall, like a loose shutter hitting the siding. I got up to check it, thinking maybe it was a branch. As I stepped toward the back, the floorboards groaned loudly under my boots. The smell in the cabin had changed. It was stronger now, sharper, like wet metal mixed with rot. My stomach tightened, The smell was coming from the small room at the back. I pointed the flashlight toward it and saw that the door to that room was half open. I hesitated, then nudged it with my foot. There was a single cot inside and a few old boxes stacked against the wall. The smell hit harder as I stepped in. My light moved across the boxes and then I saw it. In the corner, beside the cot, was a shape covered with a tarp, stiff, long, and unmistakably human-sized. For a moment, I thought it might be a dummy or an old hunting mannequin someone had left behind, but the way the tarp sagged in the middle told me it wasn't hollow. My heart started pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my neck. I didn't want to lift the tarp, but part of me needed to know. I reached out with one hand and pulled it back just a few inches. Underneath, I saw what looked like a man's hand, grayish dry, with the skin pulled tight against the bones. I dropped the tarp and stumbled backward. My flashlight shook in my hand, the beam darting across the walls and boxes. I forced myself to breathe. It didn't make sense. Why would there be a dead body here in the middle of nowhere? The smell, the tarp, the closed cabin, it wasn't recent. Whoever it was had been there for a long time. I thought about leaving right away, but the storm outside was still raging, and the temperature was near freezing. If I went out there, I might not make it back to the truck in the dark. I stayed near the front of the cabin, far from that back room, and waited for daylight. I kept the flashlight pointed at the door, just in case. Every sound outside made me tense. The wind, the branches scraping, even the rain. It was the longest night of my life. When the faint light of morning finally started to seep through the windows, I felt a rush of relief. The storm had stopped, and everything outside was covered in a thin layer of frost. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold air. I decided to follow the same path back toward the truck, moving fast this time. The forest looked different in daylight, less threatening, but still eerily quiet. When I reached the truck, I sat inside for a while to catch my breath. The cold metal of the steering wheel felt grounding. Eventually, a ranger's pickup appeared down the road. I flagged it down, and the man inside looked surprised to see me. I told him my truck had broken down, but I didn't mention the cabin right away. He offered me a ride to the nearest station, and as we drove, I finally brought it up. I described the place, the old cabin off the dirt path, the tarp, the smell. His face changed slightly, just for a second, before he nodded. He said there were a few old cabins out that way from before the forest was officially managed. Some had been used by squatters or hunters decades ago. He didn't say much else, just that they'd check it out. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me, and I called the ranger station. The person who answered didn't seem surprised. They said an investigation had been done, and the remains were of a man who had gone missing back in the early 2000s. He had apparently died of exposure, probably got lost and tried to take shelter. The cabin had been boarded up since, but the boards must have come loose over the years. That night, I sat on my porch back home and thought about how close I'd been to ending up like that man. Alone, frozen, hidden away in some forgotten place where no one would find me for years. I still drive for work, but I never take the backcountry routes anymore. And every time I see an old cabin through the trees, even from far away, I get that same cold feeling in my chest. Because I know what can be inside, nothing haunted, nothing supernatural. Just the real kind of horror that comes when someone disappears quietly and the world keeps moving without them. It was in late October of 2016 when I decided to take a short trip out to a small cabin in Northumberland, in the northern part of England. I had found the place online, a simple wooden cabin surrounded by tall pine trees and moorlands stretching for miles. It was cheap, quiet, and isolated, exactly what I needed after months of constant noise and city chaos in Manchester. The owner told me it had once been part of an old farmstead, now abandoned except for this one restored cabin that hikers sometimes rented. The drive took me nearly 5 hours. By the time I reached the cabin, the evening sky had already started turning that grayish-blue color that always seems to hang heavy before dusk. The road leading there was narrow, covered in wet leaves, and the air had a damp chill to it. When I stepped out of the car, I could smell rain-soaked soil and wood. Everything around me was quiet, except for the wind that made the trees groan softly. The cabin itself was small, built with rough timber, its roof slightly slanted and covered with moss. There was a small porch out front and one window on the side facing the woods. Inside, there was only the bare minimum: a bed, a table, a small fireplace, and a shelf with a few old books that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The place had that old wood smell mixed with a hint of mildew. It wasn't uncomfortable, though. It actually felt kind of peaceful in a lonely way. That first night, I built a small fire and made some instant noodles. The fire crackled and threw faint shadows on the wooden walls. I sat by it, reading one of the books from the shelf, an old hiking guide from the 1980s. I didn't hear anything strange that night, except the wind scraping against the cabin's exterior and a few twigs snapping outside. I told myself it was probably deer or foxes moving through the brush. The next morning, I went for a walk through the nearby woods. The ground was still damp from the rain that had passed during the night. Everything smelled of earth and wet pine. I found a narrow path behind the cabin that wound down into a low valley. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under my boots. After about 30 minutes, I came across a small clearing where I saw an old stone wall, half collapsed, covered with moss. It looked like it might have once been part of a boundary for a property. There was also a rusted metal bucket lying near it and the remains of a wooden fence. It was while I was standing there that I noticed something strange. There were faint shoe prints in the mud near the edge of the clearing. They were too small to be mine and too recent to have come from old hikers. They looked like women's shoes, maybe boots, the kind with a narrow sole. The prints were fresh, maybe from that morning, leading deeper into the woods. I didn't follow them. I just stood there for a while, staring, feeling a bit uneasy, though I couldn't explain why. When I got back to the cabin, the feeling of quiet seemed heavier. The woods around it looked darker, even though it was only mid-afternoon. I made myself tea and sat on the porch for a while, watching the trees sway in the wind. Around 5 in the evening, it started raining again, soft at first, then steady. The sound of it on the roof made me sleepy, so I lay down to rest. I woke up close to dusk, the rain had stopped, and the world outside had that washed-out look it gets after heavy weather. I went outside to stretch and noticed footprints in the mud just off the porch. I froze. The prints were small, narrow, and led from the edge of the woods straight toward the cabin. They stopped a few feet away from the porch steps. The ground there was too packed for more prints to show, but I didn't see any going back. Whoever it was had come close to the cabin. I stood there for a long time, scanning the trees. Everything was still, too still. Eventually, I went back inside, locked the door, and told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe just an animal or some other hiker who had wandered through. But the nearest village was nearly 7 miles away, and I hadn't seen another car or person since I arrived. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake listening to every small creak and shift the cabin made. Around midnight, I thought I heard a faint sound outside. Something like soft footsteps on wet ground came from behind the cabin, then stopped. I sat up, heart pounding, staring toward the small window. The glass was dark, reflecting the faint orange glow from the dying fire. I stayed like that for what felt like hours until I finally drifted off again sometime before dawn. The next morning, I stepped outside and checked around the back. There were more footprints. They were clearer this time, and I could see where they went, circling the cabin once, then stopping near the back window. I crouched down and saw where the mud had been slightly smeared against the lower frame, as if someone had rested a hand there. I felt a strange tightness in my chest, a mix of fear and disbelief. For the rest of that day, I stayed inside. I didn't go walking again. I kept the fire going and tried to distract myself with reading, but my eyes kept going to that window. Around evening, I moved one of the chairs under the handle of the front door, just to feel a little safer. I tried telling myself that maybe the person who had been out there was harmless, a lost hiker, maybe someone from a nearby cottage. But the way the prints circled the cabin made it hard to believe that. That night was worse than the last. I didn't sleep at all. Every sound made my body tense up. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something that made my skin crawl. It was faint, but it was there. A slow, dragging sound, like something being pulled across the wet ground. It came from the side of the cabin and lasted several seconds, then stopped. After that, I didn't move or breathe loudly for the rest of the night. When daylight finally came, I packed my bag. I didn't even bother making breakfast. I just wanted to leave. Before I locked up, I took one last look around. The ground was wet again from another round of light rain, and I could see new prints. They came from the trees and stopped at the back wall of the cabin again. I followed them a few steps, just enough to see that they led to a small dip in the earth, almost like a shallow trench. There was something half buried there, a piece of dark fabric, soaked and muddy. When I brushed some dirt off it, I realized it was part of a coat sleeve. It looked old and torn, maybe from years of lying there. My stomach twisted when I saw what was under it. Beneath the sleeve, a patch of pale skin was visible. It was soft, like wax, and partly covered by mud and grass. It didn't take long to understand what I was looking at. I stood up, shaking, my throat dry. I didn't look closer. I just turned around and walked straight back to my car. When I got in, my hands were trembling so badly I dropped the keys twice. As I started the engine, I caught sight of something in the rearview mirror, just for a moment. By the edge of the trees, standing half hidden between the trunks, was a woman. She wasn't moving. Her hair was dark and matted, and she was wearing something long and heavy, like an old coat. She stood perfectly still, watching. I didn't look again. I drove off that dirt road faster than I ever had in my life. When I reached the nearest town, I went straight to the police. They followed me back out there a few hours later. They found what I had seen, the shallow grave, the body, the old clothing. They said later that it looked like it had been there for at least a few years. They never said who she was or who had put her there. I never asked. I didn't want to know. I never went back to Northumberland again, and I stopped renting cabins after that. Even now, sometimes when I think about it, I still see her in my head. The woman standing by the trees, half hidden, her face pale and still, as if she had been waiting for someone to notice her all that time. It was the middle of October 2017. I had taken a few days off work to spend time alone, away from everything. Away from the city noise, the dull fluorescent lights of the office, and the constant notifications that filled every quiet second. I drove out to a small cabin in northern Montana that my uncle had built years ago. It wasn't anything fancy, just a single-story wooden cabin sitting on the edge of a forest clearing. The paint on the walls had started peeling, the porch was tilted slightly to one side, and the front steps creaked loud enough to scare off any animal that got too close. But it was quiet. That was the point. I'd packed my old Winchester rifle, some canned food, bottled water, a few extra layers of clothes, and a small propane heater. I wasn't there for any trophy hunting. I just wanted peace. Hunting kept my mind focused. It gave me something to do other than think. The area was good for deer, sometimes elk if you got lucky, and the nearest town was over an hour away. No cell service, no people, no distractions. Just the cold, dry air and the sound of wind through the pines. When I first arrived, it was late afternoon. The light was dim, but still good enough to see the treelines stretching for miles. The cabin was exactly how I remembered it from years ago. Simple, old, but sturdy. Inside, the air was thick and stale. I opened a few windows to let it breathe. Dust floated through the sunlight like tiny pieces of ash. There was a single bed with an old wool blanket, a small wood stove, and a table with one chair. A few mouse droppings on the floor told me I wasn't completely alone, but I didn't care. That first night, I didn't hunt. I just unpacked, cleaned my rifle, and set up a small lantern on the table. The woods outside were silent. I'd forgotten how dark it could get without streetlights or houses nearby. The only light came from the lantern and the dim orange glow of the heater. Every sound outside was magnified. The wind brushing the trees, the creak of the cabin wood, the occasional snap of a branch. I didn't sleep well that night. It wasn't fear. It was just too quiet, and I wasn't used to that kind of silence anymore. The next morning, I woke up early. The cold bit through my jacket as soon as I stepped outside. My breath came out in clouds. The forest floor was covered in layers of dead leaves, wet from dew. I walked for hours, following old game trails, keeping my steps slow and light. I didn't see much, just a few squirrel tracks and a fox darting between trees. Around noon, I sat down near a fallen log to rest. The air smelled like pine and earth. There was something peaceful about it, even though part of me felt uneasy. I made my way back to the cabin around evening. As the sun went down, the forest turned from golden to gray, and shadows stretched long between the trees. When I finally reached the clearing, I noticed something that stopped me for a second. Near the far side of the clearing, maybe 50 yards from the cabin, I saw a deer carcass. At least I thought it was a deer. The body was torn open badly, ribs cracked, flesh missing in chunks. I could tell it wasn't done by a hunter. The cuts were rough, uneven, and deep. There were drag marks leading from the woods, like something had pulled it out into the open. I crouched closer but didn't touch it. The smell was thick, rotting meat mixed with damp soil. Whatever killed it had done it recently. I stood there for a while, scanning the treeline, but saw nothing. No movement, no noise. The woods were dead silent again. I felt that same uneasy feeling I'd had earlier, only stronger this time. I went back inside and locked the door. That night, the wind picked up. The old cabin groaned with every gust. I sat by the heater, staring at the shadows it threw on the walls. Around midnight, I heard something outside. It was faint at first, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps moving through leaves. I froze, listening. The sound came closer, slow and deliberate. Then it stopped. For a full minute, there was nothing. Then something scraped lightly against the side of the cabin. Not hard, just a slow drag along the wood. My heart was pounding. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I reached for my rifle and held it close. I waited. After a few minutes, I heard the steps again, moving away this time, fading back into the forest. I didn't sleep after that. I sat there until the first light started coming through the window. When I finally stepped outside, the ground around the cabin was disturbed. There were tracks in the dirt, but they didn't look right. They weren't boots, not paws either. The prints were deep and wide, with long indentations at the front, almost like fingers pressing into the soil. I tried to convince myself it was a bear, but even that didn't fit. I'd seen bear tracks before. These were different. Later that day, I hiked a few miles deeper into the woods, hoping to shake off the weird feeling. But the forest was off. There were no birds, no distant sounds of movement, nothing. I remember stopping by a stream to refill my bottle when I caught sight of something on the opposite bank. A shredded piece of fabric caught in the brush. I crossed over to look closer. It was a torn flannel shirt, faded red and soaked with dark stains. Blood, dry but thick. It looked like it had been there for a few days. I didn't recognize it. It wasn't mine. That was when the reality of being completely alone hit me. No one knew where I was exactly. No one would check on me. If something happened, I'd just vanish out there like that torn shirt. When I got back to the cabin, the sun was already low. I packed my rifle, extra ammunition, and my flashlight. I didn't plan on sleeping that night either. Around 9 p.m., I heard something again, this time at the tree-line. A slow rustling, heavy, deliberate. My flashlight beam caught movement between the trees, but I couldn't see clearly what it was. Just the outline of something large, moving low to the ground. Then silence again. An hour later, I heard breathing. Not my own. Deep, slow breathing just outside the window. The glass fogged slightly, and I swear I could see the faint shape of a face or maybe just my reflection shaking. I raised my rifle, aimed at the window but didn't fire. I waited for what felt like an hour, every second stretching longer than the last. The breathing stopped, but I didn't move until morning. When daylight came, I went outside again. More tracks, same shape, same strange prints, circled the cabin. The deer carcass was gone, completely. No bones, no blood, nothing left but flattened grass where it had been. I packed my things fast. I didn't even eat breakfast. I loaded everything into the truck, double-checked my rifle, and started the engine. As I drove away, I looked back once. Near the tree-line, I saw something move again. It stood just far enough that I couldn't see details, only its shape. It was tall, hunched, and still. It wasn't an animal I recognized, and it didn't move like one either. It just watched until the road curved and I couldn't see it anymore. When I got back to town, I stopped at a gas station and sat there for a while, just trying to process it. I didn't tell anyone. How would I even explain it? All I knew was that something out there wasn't normal, not supernatural, just wrong. Something that belonged there but didn't want me there. I never went back to that cabin again. I sold it a year later without ever mentioning what happened. Sometimes at night, when I can't sleep, I still think about those tracks. About the sound of breathing outside the window. I tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear, maybe something I misheard, but deep down I know what I felt. It wasn't fear of the dark or being alone. It was the feeling that I'd been watched for days, and whatever was out there knew exactly when to stop watching. That's what still gets me. Not what I saw, but how careful it was. How quiet. How close it got without ever being seen clearly. I left those woods alive, but I know something out there watched me leave, and it wanted me to. It was the fall of 2013 when I took a temporary assignment as a park ranger at Bitter Creek National Reserve in northern Wyoming. I was 29 at the time, and though I'd worked in smaller parks before, this one was different. Spread across endless stretches of pine-covered hills, dry meadows, and old mining grounds that hadn't been touched in decades. The ranger station sat near the entrance, but there was also a smaller cabin about 8 miles deeper into the park. That cabin was meant for overnight patrols and isolated shifts. It wasn't meant to be comfortable, just functional bare essentials. A cot, a wood stove, a small table, and a shortwave radio. I was told I'd be spending a few nights there each week, making sure no campers were wandering too deep into restricted zones. Those zones weren't dangerous in any supernatural sense. Just unstable ground, leftover mining shafts, and steep drop-offs that could easily kill someone careless enough to wander at night. My first few weeks went smoothly. The days were quiet, sometimes eerily so. The forest up there wasn't loud with birds or wind like others I'd worked in. It felt heavy, like the air was thicker, quieter, and even the crunch of your own boots sounded muted. One late October evening, I headed up to the cabin after checking a few trails near the western boundary. The sky was already dim by the time I parked the truck at the dirt trailhead. From there, it was a mile hike uphill to reach the cabin. The air had that dry coldness that came before snow, and I could smell pine sap and old leaves crushed underfoot. By the time I reached the cabin, the last bit of daylight was gone, and everything was tinted in that blue shade that falls between sunset and full darkness. The cabin looked the same as always, small, plain, with its wooden sides darkened by years of weather. The forest surrounded it on all sides except for a narrow clearing that faced downhill toward Bitter Creek itself. The silence there was deep, not peaceful, just heavy. Inside, I set my gear down, lit the oil lamp, and got a small fire going in the stove. The warmth felt good, and I took a moment to sit, stretch, and listen to the soft ticking of the metal as it heated up. Nights like that were simple. Log my patrol notes, check the weather, radio in a quick report, and then rest. I had no cell service out there. Only the shortwave radio could reach the main station, and even that depended on conditions. Around 8:30, I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint crunching sound. My first thought was deer. There were plenty around, but the steps were slow, steady, and heavy enough to catch my attention. I stood quietly near the door, holding my flashlight but not turning it on yet. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I didn't hear running or more movement, just silence again. I brushed it off at first. Animals often wandered close to the cabin because of the warmth or leftover scents from food. But later, when I stepped out to get more wood from the stack near the side wall, I noticed something odd. The ground was dry and hard-packed, yet there were prints. Fresh ones, slightly sunk into the dirt, spaced in a way that looked too wide for any animal. They were boot prints. They led from the trees to about 20 feet from the cabin and then stopped. I scanned around with my flashlight, the beams slicing through the dark, catching the edges of tree trunks and branches, but nothing moved. The idea that someone else might be wandering this deep into the park at night didn't sit right with me. No campers were allowed this far in, and hunters needed special permits that were logged at the main station. I hadn't seen anyone all day. I went back inside, latched the door, and sat near the stove, listening. The wind started to pick up, faintly whistling through the cracks in the walls. Every so often, I think I heard something outside again, but it was hard to tell if it was real or just the forest shifting. Around midnight, I decided to lie down. I kept my flashlight beside the cot and left the fire burning low. I was just starting to drift off when I heard the sound again. Footsteps, this time slower, moving around the side of the cabin. The boards creaked slightly as if someone brushed against the wall. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I sat up and stayed still, trying to listen through the wind. The steps circled once around the cabin and then stopped completely near the front porch. I waited, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10. I don't even remember breathing during that time. Finally, I got up, grabbed the flashlight, and swung open the door. The clearing was empty. The forest was black beyond the edge of the light. The prints were back, fresh ones this time, clear boot impressions leading right up to the front step. But again, they just stopped there. No other tracks led away. The distance between each step suggested someone tall, maybe a man. I felt uneasy but tried to rationalize it. Maybe a hiker got lost and came by for shelter. But if that were true, why not knock? Why not call out? The silence made less and less sense. I barely slept that night. Every small noise made me sit up, tense and alert. When morning finally came, I stepped outside to get a better look. The prints were still there but lighter now, half faded by the dry wind. I followed them into the trees for maybe 50 yards before they suddenly veered off and vanished into a patch of rocky ground. No sign of anyone. I radioed it in when I got back to the cabin, told the station that there might have been someone wandering near my post. They said they'd checked the permit logs, but no one was scheduled to be out there that night. I didn't say much else. That afternoon, I went down to Bitter Creek to check for signs of camping or fires. Near the water, I found something that froze me. A torn scrap of red flannel, tangled in the low brush. It looked old but not ancient. I pocketed it and kept moving. Over the next week, I stayed at the main station instead of the cabin. The supervisor didn't ask why. Shifts rotated like that sometimes. But when I had to go back for another patrol the following weekend, I couldn't shake the unease. The second night there, it all happened again, soft steps, just before midnight, circling the cabin. The same pattern. I didn't even look out this time. I just sat there, listening, gripping my flashlight with both hands, waiting for it to stop. It always stopped near the front porch. Always there. When daylight came, I checked again. The prints were there. Boots again, but this time I noticed something else. The left print was slightly deeper than the right, as if whoever it was had a limp or uneven gait. That small detail made my stomach twist for some reason I couldn't explain. I spent that whole morning searching within a quarter mile of the cabin. I found an old mining access tunnel not far from the ridge, a narrow opening half covered with brush and boards. I had passed it before but never paid attention. The boards were recently disturbed. Some were moved aside, showing the dark hole leading underground. I crouched and shined my light inside. The beam caught on an old sleeping bag, half buried under dirt, and what looked like empty food cans and a rusted lantern. Someone had been living there, not recently but not too long ago either. The cans weren't rusted through, and the sleeping bag hadn't rotted completely. I reported it when I got back to the main station that afternoon. A few days later, a ranger team went out and checked it properly. They said the site likely belonged to a missing hiker from a few years earlier, someone who disappeared in the park and was never found. They collected what was left and sealed the entrance. After that, the footsteps never returned. Even years later, I can still remember the sound of them circling that cabin, slow and deliberate, like whoever it was didn't want to come in but didn't want to leave either. I don't believe in anything supernatural. What scared me wasn't a ghost. It was knowing that for nights on end, someone had been out there in the dark, standing just feet away, silent, watching. It made me realize how thin the walls really are in those kinds of places, how fragile that sense of safety can be. I still work as a ranger today, but I've never stayed in that cabin again. Every time I pass by Bitter Creek, I slow down and look up at that ridge, at that small dot of wood between the trees, and wonder how long he'd been there before I ever noticed. It was late October of 1998 when I decided to stay a few nights at an old cabin I had inherited from my uncle. The cabin was in a small rural area outside a town called Merrowfield, about 2 hours north of the city. The strange part wasn't the cabin itself, it was where it was built. My uncle had built it right next to a graveyard. Not a large one, just a small fenced patch of uneven ground with about a dozen headstones, most of them so old that the names had faded off. I had only been there once before when I was a kid, but I remembered the quietness of that place. It had a heavy stillness, the kind that felt like the air itself didn't move. I arrived there in the early afternoon. The sky was gray, and the wind carried that dry, crisp smell of dead leaves. The dirt road leading to the cabin was narrow, overgrown with weeds that brushed against the sides of my truck. When I finally pulled up to the clearing, I saw the cabin leaning slightly to one side like it had been tired for years. The wood was weathered gray, the windows dusty and fogged from the inside. The roof sagged a little near the back. It wasn't the kind of place you'd want to live in, but I only planned to stay for 3 nights, just to clear my head and go through some of my uncle's old stuff that was supposedly left behind. There was a wire fence separating the yard from the graveyard, about 20 feet from the cabin's back porch. The gate was half off its hinges, swinging whenever the wind picked up. I could see some of the tombstones leaning at odd angles, one even cracked straight down the middle. The grass there was longer, darker, and looked like it hadn't been cut in years. For some reason, even though I told myself I wasn't superstitious, I didn't like facing that direction. It made me uneasy knowing those graves were right behind where I'd be sleeping. Inside the cabin, the air smelled like old wood, dust, and a bit of mildew. The floor creaked under every step, and spiderwebs hung in the corners. The main room had a small couch, a wood stove, and a rickety table with 2 chairs. There was no electricity, just an oil lamp sitting on the counter near a small gas stove. I unpacked my bag, lit the lamp, and tried to settle in. I had brought enough canned food and water to last a few days. There was an old journal on the table with my uncle's name written on the front cover in faded ink, but I didn't open it right away. I wanted to get the place cleaned up first. As the sun went down, the temperature dropped fast. The cabin walls did little to keep the cold out. I threw some wood into the stove and sat for a while, listening to the wind outside. It made a low whistling sound through the cracks in the window frame. I could hear leaves scraping against the roof. Every so often, there'd be a soft tapping from somewhere inside, like a piece of wood shifting or an acorn falling on the porch. I told myself it was nothing unusual, just nature settling in for the night. By the time I went to bed, it was pitch black outside. The graveyard was invisible through the window. I kept the oil lamp burning low because the dark inside that cabin felt different, thicker somehow. Lying on the old bed, I stared at the ceiling and tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't completely alone there. Not in a supernatural sense, but more like the way you feel when someone's standing behind you watching quietly. The silence pressed down on everything. Even the wind had stopped. I woke up sometime after midnight to a sound that didn't belong. It was faint, but it was there. A dull metallic clinking, like something tapping against metal. I lay still, holding my breath. Came again, steady and slow. It sounded like it was coming from outside, maybe near the fence. I sat up and looked toward the window, but I couldn't see anything beyond my reflection. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag, slipped on my jacket, and went out onto the porch. The cold hit me hard. The beam of light cut through the misty air, and I saw small movements near the graveyard fence. I thought maybe it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or coyote. I walked closer, boots crunching over the dead leaves, and the sound stopped. When I reached the fence, I noticed the gate was swinging wide open. I was sure I had closed it earlier. I tightened the latch and stood there for a while, scanning the area, but nothing moved. The graves sat in silence, their stones wet from dew, and the trees beyond swayed slightly. I turned back toward the cabin, and that's when I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt, fresh ones, not mine. They were smaller, like someone barefoot had been walking near the fence, circling around. I followed them a few steps, but they disappeared near the tall grass. My skin prickled, and I felt a knot in my stomach. Maybe some kids had been messing around earlier, though it seemed unlikely anyone would come out this far for a prank. I decided not to overthink it. I went back inside, locked the door, and shoved a chair under the handle just in case. Took me a long time to fall asleep again. The next morning, the air felt heavier. The sky hadn't cleared, and there was a dampness that made everything smell like wet earth. I went outside to check the area in daylight. The footprints were mostly gone now, washed out by the morning dew. The gate, though, was wide open again. This time I found the latch lying in the grass. It hadn't broken. It had been unscrewed. That detail bothered me more than anything. Someone had taken the time to remove it. I spent the afternoon trying to distract myself. I chopped some wood, cooked a can of beans on the stove, and finally opened my uncle's journal. Most of it was about hunting, repairs, and notes about the land, but toward the end, the entries got shorter and stranger. One of the last pages mentioned hearing things at night near the graveyard. "Footsteps by the fence again," he wrote. "Sounds like someone breathing out there." The handwriting became messy after that. The final entry just said, asterisk, "Can't sleep anymore. Don't go outside." Asterisk. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed with my flashlight next to me, the lamp still burning. Every sound felt sharper, like the cabin itself was listening. Around midnight, I heard it again, the same clinking sound. Then, softer, the crunch of footsteps. They were coming closer this time, slow, deliberate. My chest tightened. I didn't move. I just listened. The steps reached the porch. Then came the faint sound of wood bending, as if someone had stepped on the first board near the door. I froze completely. For several minutes, there was nothing, just the creaking of the wood under weight that didn't shift away. I waited until I was sure I couldn't hear anything, then grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the door. The bottom edge of the door had a small gap, and through it, I saw a shadow move. Not a full shape, just the suggestion of movement. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it echo inside my head. I didn't open the door. Couldn't. I just sat there until the sound faded away. When dawn finally came, I went outside again. The ground near the porch had new prints, bare feet just like before. Only this time there were more of them. They led from the graveyard gate to the porch and then off toward the woods. I followed them with the flashlight still in my hand, even though it was daylight. They stopped near the treeline, where I found a small pile of something. It looked like bits of fabric and rope. When I picked it up, it smelled faintly of smoke and earth. It wasn't recent, it had been there for a while. I decided I'd had enough. I packed my things and loaded them into the truck. Before leaving, I walked back to the graveyard one last time. I don't even know why. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that there was nothing to fear. The headstones were still, the air quiet, but I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Near the far corner, one grave had fresh dirt on it. Just a small patch that looked disturbed, like someone had dug there recently and then covered it again quickly. There was a shovel lying beside it, rusted but clearly used. I didn't touch it. I left Marrowfield that morning and never went back. A few months later, I heard that the cabin had burned down after a storm. The fire department said it was probably caused by lightning, though they didn't find any clear signs of a strike. Sometimes, when I think about those footprints and the way the latch had been unscrewed, I wonder if someone had been living out there. Someone who used that graveyard as shelter, hiding among the graves where no one would look. The thought of that still keeps me awake some nights. Not ghosts, not monsters, just someone desperate enough to live where no one should. It was late October of 2018 when I decided to take a short trip out to northern Montana for a bit of solitude. I'd been living in Billings for a few years, and city life had started to wear me down. I wasn't dealing with anything dramatic, just noise, people, traffic, the constant feeling that I could never think properly. So I rented a small, off-grid cabin through a local listing site. It was about an hour and a half north of Helena, close to a place called Lincoln. The listing photos made it look cozy, with stove, small porch, trees all around, no neighbors for miles. The owner said there was no cell service, but there was a small radio for weather updates. That sounded perfect. The drive out there took longer than expected because the road turned to gravel for the last 8 miles. It wound through thick pine forests and small clearings that looked like they hadn't seen a vehicle in months. The sun was low by the time I got there, casting long, soft shadows through the trees. The cabin was smaller than I thought, just one main room with a bed, table, stove, and a small area for cooking. It looked old but clean. There was an outhouse a few steps behind it, down a short path. The air was sharp, cold enough that I could see my breath when I got out of the car. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and faint smoke, the kind of smell that clings to the walls from years of heating fires. I unpacked my bag, lit the stove, and got a small fire going. It was quiet, unnervingly quiet. No cars, no wind, no animals. Just the occasional crack of wood inside the stove. I ate some canned soup, wrote a few notes in my journal, and went to bed early. That first night was fine. The silence took a bit of getting used to, but I slept all right. The second day, I woke up to frost on the windows and a sky so clear it almost looked fake. I went for a walk through the woods around mid-morning, staying close to the trail that led from the cabin down toward a dried creek bed. There were animal tracks in the mud, deer, maybe elk. I didn't see anyone or anything unusual. I spent most of the day reading, splitting some wood, and taking photos. It felt good to be away from everything. But that night, something felt off. Around 10 p.m., I was lying in bed with the fire dying down when I heard a sound outside. A quick crunch, like someone stepping on frozen ground. I thought maybe it was an animal, maybe a deer. I sat up, listening. The sound came again, a little closer this time. I turned off my lantern and waited. The cabin was small, and when the fire went out, it got pitch black. I couldn't hear anything for a minute. Then a faint scraping sound came from the porch. Not a heavy noise, just a soft drag, like something brushing across the wood. I told myself it was probably a branch or a raccoon, but my heart was beating fast anyway. I stayed still until the sound stopped. When I finally fell asleep again, it was nearly 2 in the morning. The next morning, I went outside to look. There were faint marks on the porch boards, thin, shallow lines near the steps. They looked like something had been dragged across it. Maybe a stick or maybe the paw of some animal. I checked around the area but didn't see any fresh tracks in the dirt. It made me uneasy, but I tried not to dwell on it. Things look stranger than they are when you're alone. That afternoon, the air changed. The wind picked up, and clouds rolled in fast. The radio mentioned a possible early snow flurry. I gathered extra wood and double-checked the door latch. The cabin had an old wooden door with a hook-style lock from the inside. Not the most secure thing, but it worked. By nightfall, the wind was strong enough to make the trees creak. I sat near the stove with my flashlight and tried reading, but I couldn't focus. Every sound outside felt louder than it should have been. Around 11 p.m., I heard the sound again. That crunch of footsteps, slow and uneven. I froze, holding the flashlight. The steps came closer, stopping right outside the cabin. The floorboards creaked under weight. Then there was a pause. No movement, no sound, just stillness. I waited, barely breathing. After maybe a minute, I heard something soft press against the door. A faint thump, like a palm or shoulder leaning against it. I could feel my throat tighten. I didn't move or turn on the light. Then, as slowly as it started, it went quiet again. The wind took over, covering every other sound. I stayed awake the entire night. When morning came, the air was colder and heavy with moisture. I opened the door carefully and looked around. There were no footprints that I could see, but the ground was hard and dry, so that didn't mean much. I walked around the cabin and found nothing disturbed. I told myself maybe it was a bear or a moose passing by, but deep down it didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate, like someone had been standing there, listening. By the 4th day, I couldn't shake the unease. I thought about packing up early, but I'd paid for the week and didn't want to seem paranoid. I kept the radio on low during the day just to have some background noise. That night, I made sure the fire stayed burning longer. Around midnight, I heard it again, this time behind the cabin, near the outhouse. It wasn't footsteps this time, but a light tapping sound, irregular, like something knocking against wood. The wind had died down, so the noise carried clearly. I didn't go outside. I just sat on the edge of the bed with the flashlight aimed at the door, waiting for it to stop. Eventually it did, but I never fell back asleep. The next morning, I checked the back path. There were more marks in the dirt. Not footprints exactly, more like drag lines. They led from the outhouse toward the tree line. I couldn't tell what made them. I decided I'd leave the next day no matter what. The peace I came for was gone. That night was the worst. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a faint rattling sound. It was the door latch, shaking, slow at first, then harder. Someone was trying to open it. My body went numb. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it at the door, but the beam just lit up the old wood and dust particles floating in the air. The rattling stopped for a moment, then started again, faster, more deliberate. I held my breath, listening to the wood strain slightly under pressure. Then it stopped completely. Silence again. I waited for what felt like hours before the first hint of dawn showed through the frosted window. When I finally opened the door that morning, my stomach dropped. There were clear boot prints on the porch, not animal tracks, not random shapes, but real human boot prints. They came from the tree line, stopped at the door, then turned back. I looked out toward the woods and saw a faint trail through the frost leading away. Whoever it was had been there for real, watching, waiting. I didn't bother packing everything neatly. I threw my bag into the car, left half my food on the table, and drove off. The gravel road felt endless, the forest pressing in on both sides. When I reached the highway, I finally checked my phone and saw 2 missed calls from an unknown number. No voice mail. My hands were still shaking on the steering wheel. Later, I contacted the cabin owner and told him someone had been on the property at night. He said no one else had access to it and that the nearest neighbor was almost 4 miles away. He sounded surprised but not alarmed. He said maybe it was a lost hunter or a local who got turned around. Maybe, but those boot prints were right at the door. They weren't wandering tracks, they stopped there and stood there for a while. I never went back. For weeks afterward, I kept thinking about the sounds, the dragging, the knocking, the pressure on the door. The thing that haunts me the most isn't the fear I felt. It's the thought that whoever was out there knew exactly how far they could go without making me see them. They wanted me to know they were there, but not enough to confront them. That kind of patience doesn't come from someone lost. It comes from someone who's done it before. I still think about that cabin sometimes. The sound of the wind through the trees, the smell of smoke, the way the cold air burned in my lungs. But most of all, I think about those footprints, how close they were to the door, how long they might have been standing there, listening to me breathe in the dark. It was late October, 2016, when I decided to take a few days off from work and head out into the woods of northern Maine. I had been dealing with too many sleepless nights, too much noise, and a job that left me staring at screens for hours. I wanted silence, real silence, the kind you can only find far away from everything. I had seen online that there were a few hiking trails near an old logging route, and somewhere near one of them was said to be a long-abandoned cabin. Most people said it had been empty for decades. That caught my interest. I figured it would be a quiet place to rest and maybe take some pictures. I left my small apartment in Bangor early in the morning. My car was packed with a sleeping bag, a flashlight, some canned food, and a cheap tent in case the cabin wasn't in any shape to stay in. The drive took almost 4 hours. The paved road turned to gravel, and eventually the gravel turned to mud and broken dirt. I parked my car near the start of an overgrown trail, grabbed my backpack, and started walking. The air was cool, but not freezing. The ground was soft from the rain that had fallen the night before. Every step made a quiet sucking sound in the mud. I walked for what felt like 2 hours before I saw anything man-made. Just endless trees, moss, and the occasional sound of a crow or squirrel. Then, about a mile farther in, I noticed a set of tire ruts cutting off from the trail. They were old, maybe decades old, but they went deeper into the woods, half covered by fallen branches and leaves. I decided to follow them. The ruts eventually led to a clearing, and there it was, the cabin. It looked worse than I expected. The wood was gray and splintered, the roof sagged in the middle, and one of the shutters had come off and was lying on the ground. The place looked like it hadn't been touched since the 1970s. There was an old metal barrel near the porch with a hole rusted through its side and some pieces of broken glass scattered nearby. I walked up the short steps to the porch. The boards creaked under my weight, but they held. The front door was closed, but not locked. When I pushed it open, the hinges made a long, slow groaning sound. Inside, it smelled like dust, wet wood, and something faintly sour like old rotting fabric. The light from outside came through the gaps in the walls, showing floating dust in the air. There was one room and what looked like a small kitchen area. An iron stove sat against the far wall, rusted and full of cobwebs. A few broken chairs were piled in one corner, and in another stood a table that was half collapsed. There was a narrow hallway that led to a back room, maybe a bedroom. I could hear water dripping somewhere, slow and steady. The first thing I did was check the floor. Some parts were soft, so I avoided walking near the corners. I dropped my backpack on the table and went to the window. The view was nothing but trees and gray light. The silence was heavy. I remember thinking it was the quietest place I'd ever been in my life. No wind, no insects, nothing. Just silence. I decided I would stay the night. I set up my sleeping bag in the front room, right next to the wall where it seemed the floor was still solid. I ate a can of beans cold and wrote a few notes in a small journal I always carried. The sun was already setting when I went outside to gather some dry sticks from around the clearing. I made a small fire pit just a few feet from the porch and lit it with a match. As night came, the temperature dropped fast. The fire's light flickered across the cabin walls, making everything inside look darker than it was. I noticed something odd around 9 or 10 that night. When I stood by the fire and looked back toward the trees, I could see movement, small, quick shadows between the trunks. Probably animals, I thought. Deer, maybe. But the way the movements stopped every time I looked directly at them made me uneasy. I stayed close to the fire for another hour before going back inside. I shut the door, though it barely closed properly. I rolled up in my sleeping bag and turned off my flashlight. I expected to fall asleep quickly, but I didn't. The silence made me alert. Every sound, the small creak of the wood, the soft patter of water dripping somewhere, felt sharper than it should. It must have been around midnight when I heard the first real noise. It wasn't the usual creak or drip. It sounded like footsteps, very slow ones. I froze and kept still. The steps were outside, circling the cabin. The sound came from one side, then the back, then stopped. I held my breath for a long time, then nothing, just silence again. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon, but deep down I didn't believe it. Those steps had weight to them. I stayed awake until the faint gray of dawn started showing through the window cracks. When I finally got up, my body felt stiff. I stepped outside to check around the cabin. The ground was soft from the rain, so footprints should have been visible, but there were none. No animal prints either, just smooth, wet dirt. I remember that made me feel worse than seeing prints would have. I decided I didn't want to spend another night there. I started packing up, but I wanted to look around the back of the cabin before leaving. The ground there was uneven, sloping down slightly. I noticed something strange. A section of the ground near the wall looked like it had been disturbed not too long ago. The soil was darker, looser, and not covered by leaves like the rest of the area. It looked like someone had dug there and filled it back in. Curiosity got the better of me. I found an old piece of metal roofing near the barrel and used it like a shovel. After a few minutes of digging, I hit something hard. I cleared away more dirt and saw what looked like a rusted metal box. It was about the size of a small cooler. I pulled it out and wiped off the dirt. The hinges were rusted shut, but I managed to pry it open with a rock. Inside were a few old tools, some nails, and a folded piece of cloth wrapped around something. When I unwrapped it, I found a small, old revolver and a torn piece of paper with faded writing. The words were smudged, but I could make out a few phrases. Something about staying quiet and don't come back. That was enough for me. I dropped the paper and put the revolver back. I buried the box again and filled the dirt back over it. By the time I packed up and started walking back, it was late morning. The air felt heavier, like it was about to rain again. The woods seemed different in daylight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stopped walking, I thought I heard something behind me. Soft steps stopping just when I did. I didn't look back. It took me almost 3 hours to reach my car. When I finally saw it through the trees, it felt like a huge relief. But when I got closer, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were muddy handprints on the driver's side door and window. They were fresh, darker than the dried mud on the trail. I stood there staring for a long minute, my heart pounding. I unlocked the door, got in, and started the engine immediately. The drive back felt endless. Every turn in the dirt road made me glance at the mirrors, expecting to see someone or something standing in the trees. When I finally reached the highway, I pulled over at a gas station and sat in the car for a while, just breathing. I didn't tell anyone about what I'd found. I didn't call the police. I didn't take any pictures. I just drove home and tried to forget about it. But the thing is, even now, almost 10 years later, I still remember the sound of those footsteps circling the cabin. I still see those muddy handprints in my head sometimes. I haven't gone camping since. And sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I think I hear that same slow, heavy step somewhere outside my apartment door. Like whoever was out there that night never really stayed behind in the woods. It was the summer of 2013 when I decided to build a small cabin for myself. I was 27 then, working as a carpenter in a small town in Oregon. I had saved just enough money to buy a piece of land at the edge of a dense forest about an hour outside of town. It wasn't big, maybe an acre and a half, but it was quiet, surrounded by tall pine trees and thick brush, with a narrow dirt path that led to a small clearing. I wanted to build something with my own hands, something small but solid, a place where I could spend weekends away from the noise and the constant rush of people. The cabin took me about 2 months to finish. It was only about 12 by 16 feet, just enough for a bed, a small wood stove, a table, and some shelves. I didn't bother running electricity out there. I brought a small battery lantern, a few candles, and used a propane stove to cook. The walls were made of rough pine boards, and the roof was covered with metal sheets I salvaged from an old shed. It wasn't perfect, but it felt like mine. By early September, it was finally complete. The weather had started to turn colder, and that's when the nights began to stretch longer. I decided to spend a night there to see how it felt staying alone in the middle of nowhere. The day started off calm, the sky gray and heavy, the smell of rain already in the air. I packed a few things, some canned food, a thermos of coffee, a small toolbox, and a blanket, and drove my old pickup down the narrow road that led to the cabin. The rain started falling just as I parked the truck beside the clearing. It came down in slow drops at first, soft enough to make a steady tapping on the hood. By the time I carried my things inside, it had turned into a steady pour. The air smelled like wet pine and soil, the kind of smell that's strong but strangely calming. Inside, it was dim. I set the lantern on the table and lit it, casting a soft orange glow across the small room. The rain kept getting heavier, the wind pushing it sideways so that it rattled against the windows. I stood near the doorway for a while, just listening to it. There was something oddly peaceful about being shut in like that, with only the sound of rain hitting the roof and the trees swaying outside. But as the night went on, that peace started to feel heavier. Around 9, the rain picked up hard, came down like a sheet, hammering the metal roof so loud I could barely think. The wind howled through the trees, bending the tall pines until I could hear the creak of their trunks. Every so often, there'd be a crack from somewhere deeper in the forest, branches breaking under the force of the storm. I pulled my jacket tighter and checked the corners of the cabin, making sure the windows were latched and the door was secure. The lantern flickered a few times, and I remember feeling the weight of the silence between each flicker. When it dimmed, the shadows around the cabin seemed to stretch longer, darker. I tried to keep busy, heated up a can of soup, wrote a few notes in my small notebook about things I might fix or improve, but every time I stopped moving, I'd catch some small sound that didn't fit the rhythm of the rain. First, it was just something faint, a soft scrape, like something brushing against the outside wall. I told myself it was probably a branch or some debris blowing in the wind. But a few minutes later, I heard it again, this time closer, dragging slower from one side of the cabin to the other. I froze, listening. The rain was still pounding the roof, but under that constant noise, I could hear something else. A dull thud, then another, spaced apart like slow footsteps moving through the mud outside. I held my breath and tried to listen for direction, but the sound seemed to move around the cabin, shifting from one wall to the next. I didn't have a gun, just a small hammer I'd brought along with the tools. I took it and stood near the window, trying to see through the rain. The glass was fogged up, and outside was nothing but black shapes. The outline of trees, a flash of wet bark when lightning lit up the sky for a split second. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling that something was out there didn't go away. Minutes stretched longer. The sound stopped for a while, replaced by the steady roar of rain. I started to think maybe I'd imagined it, that my mind was just playing tricks on me. Then came another noise, this time sharp, sudden. A loud snap from behind the cabin, like a stick breaking under weight. It was followed by a heavy rustling, like something moving through wet brush. I felt the air inside the cabin go still. The storm kept roaring outside, but everything inside me went quiet. I stood by the wall for what felt like hours, staring at the door, waiting for another sound. I didn't even realize I'd been holding the hammer so tight that my fingers had gone numb. Eventually, I decided to sit back on the bed, still facing the door. Couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, thinking of what it could be. Maybe a deer, maybe even a bear. It wasn't impossible. The forest had plenty of them, and I had some food inside. The scent might have drawn something in. Still, the idea of being alone out there, with nothing but thin wooden walls between me and whatever was outside, made my stomach tighten. Hours passed like that. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I remember was waking up to a loud bang. The sound came from the side of the cabin, hard enough to make the lantern shake on the table. I jumped up, heart pounding, and grabbed the hammer again. The rain had slowed a little, but the wind was still strong. I moved toward the wall and pressed my ear against it, trying to make out any movement. Nothing, just the wind. Then, as I started to step back, I heard a soft dragging sound again, something scraping across the wooden siding. I didn't even realize I'd been holding my breath until it stopped. When it finally did, I felt my chest ache from the tension. I decided I couldn't just sit there waiting anymore. I grabbed my flashlight, pushed the door open, and stepped outside. The air hit me like ice. The rain was cold and steady now, dripping from the roof and running down my face. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, lighting up the ground in front of me. Mud, puddles, branches scattered from the storm, but no footprints, no sign of anything nearby. I walked slowly around the cabin, shining the light along the walls, the trees, the small clearing beyond. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By the time I circled back to the door, I was soaked through. I stepped inside again, locked it, and set the flashlight on the table. My heart was still hammering. The only thing that calmed me a little was knowing dawn wasn't too far off. When morning finally came, the rain had stopped. The forest looked different, bright, almost calm again. But when I stepped outside, I noticed the ground along one side of the cabin was torn up. Deep, uneven marks in the mud, like something had dragged across it. They weren't footprints, not clearly at least. Just long, shallow grooves, stretching toward the tree line. I stood there for a long time, staring at them, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a fallen branch had been moved by the wind, or maybe an animal had wandered too close. Either way, I didn't stick around to find out. I packed up my things, locked the cabin, and drove back to town. A week later, I went back to check on it. The forest was quiet again, the ground dry, everything looking normal. But when I walked around to the back of the cabin, I saw that one of the lower boards on the wall had been split clean in half, like something had hit it hard. The wood was cracked, splintered in a way that didn't look like weather damage. I fixed it, but after that night, I never stayed there again. I kept the cabin, but I only went back during the day, mostly to check on it or to grab tools I'd left behind. Even now, years later, I still remember that dragging sound against the wall and the marks in the mud the next morning. Whatever was out there that night, it wasn't the storm. And it wasn't my imagination either. It was something real, something that walked close enough to touch the walls I built with my own hands, then disappeared into the forest like it had never been there at all. It was late October of 1998 when I decided to take a short trip out to my uncle's old farm in southern Nebraska. I was 26 at the time, and things weren't going too great for me. I'd lost my job a few weeks earlier, my apartment lease was ending soon, and I needed time away from everything. The farm had been abandoned for years after my uncle passed, but the land still belonged to the family. My father told me the place was still standing, barely, and that I could stay there if I wanted. I figured some quiet time might clear my head, so I packed my things and drove out early in the morning. The drive took nearly 6 hours. The further I got from the city, the emptier everything looked. The roads turned from smooth asphalt to cracked country lanes, then eventually to gravel. By the time I got close, there were barely any signs of life. Just endless fields of dry corn and a few rotting fences leaning in the wind. The last stretch of road was so narrow that weeds brushed the sides of my truck. It felt like I was driving into a place forgotten by everyone, including time itself. When I finally saw the old farmhouse, it looked worse than I'd imagined. The paint had peeled off almost completely, leaving the wood gray and splintered. The roof sagged on one side, and one of the windows upstairs was broken. There was an old windmill nearby, but it didn't turn anymore. It just creaked whenever the wind picked up. The air had that dry, dusty smell of old soil and mold. The barn stood off to the right, its big doors hanging open, and beside it was a smaller cabin. More like a shed, really, that I remembered faintly from when I was a kid. My uncle used to store tools in there, or sometimes stay overnight when he worked late. I decided to stay in that smaller cabin instead of the main house because it looked easier to keep warm and clean. The main farmhouse was too big and felt hollow in a way that made me uneasy. The cabin at least seemed manageable. I unlocked the rusted latch with a bit of force and pushed the door open. The air inside was stale, heavy with dust. A few old chairs were stacked in a corner, and there was a small cot against the wall, covered in a torn blanket. The floorboards creaked under my boots, but otherwise, the place seemed solid enough. I swept the dust off the cot, unrolled my sleeping bag, and unpacked a few supplies. Some canned food, a flashlight, a small propane stove, and a folding knife. I planned to stay for 3 or 4 nights. My goal was to just clear my head, maybe write in my notebook, walk around the fields, and get some quiet. That first evening, I walked around the property before the sun went down. The fields stretched endlessly, full of dry stalks swaying softly in the wind. I noticed the faint smell of something rotten near the barn, but I didn't pay much attention. I figured maybe some animal had died nearby. When it got dark, I sat by the cabin door with a lantern, ate a can of beans, and listened to the wind. It was peaceful in a lonely kind of way. The only sounds were the faint rustling of corn and the occasional creak of old wood. But that peace didn't last long. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something scraping outside. It wasn't loud, but in the silence, it stood out. It was steady, like metal dragging across wood. I thought maybe it was just the wind moving some loose sheet of tin around, so I tried to ignore it, but the sound didn't stop. Came from near the barn, I could tell that much. It went on for maybe a minute, then stopped. Then, a few minutes later, I heard it again, closer this time. I sat up, grabbed my flashlight, and waited. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was probably an animal. Out here, raccoons or coyotes weren't unusual. After a while, the sound faded, and I went back to sleep. The next morning, I walked to the barn to check it out. The grass was flattened in a few spots near the entrance, and one of the doors had fresh scratches on it. Long, uneven ones, almost like something with claws had scraped it. I crouched down and saw muddy prints in the dirt. They weren't boot prints, but they didn't look quite like any animal I recognized either. They were too wide, too flat. I convinced myself they were probably from a stray dog or something similar. Still, the air around the barn felt strange, stale and cold, like the kind of air that hasn't moved in years. I didn't go inside the barn that day. Instead, I stuck close to the cabin, chopped some firewood, and tried to keep busy. But the thought of those scratches kept bothering me. That night, I made sure to lock the cabin door and push one of the old chairs against it. I left my flashlight next to my sleeping bag, just in case. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up again. This time, it wasn't the scraping sound, it was footsteps. Slow, heavy ones, circling the cabin. I could hear the dirt crunch under each step. My chest tightened as I lay there in the dark, trying not to move. The steps stopped right outside the door. Then I heard the soft sound of breathing, faint but unmistakable. Whoever or whatever it was stood there for a while. Then, just as suddenly, it walked away. I didn't sleep again that night. I just waited for dawn. When morning came, I stepped outside to look. The ground outside the door was disturbed. Muddy footprints again, the same wide, flat kind as before. They led off toward the barn. That was enough for me. I decided I'd leave the next day. The peace I'd come for wasn't here, but that night turned out to be the worst of all. Around sunset, I noticed movement in the field, a shape moving low through the corn. It wasn't tall enough to be a person standing, but it moved too deliberately to be an animal. I watched it for a while until it disappeared. As soon as the light started fading, I went inside, locked the door, and sat with my flashlight ready. The cabin felt smaller than ever. The walls groaned in the wind, and every sound made my skin crawl. Hours passed before anything happened. Then, right after midnight, I heard the barn doors slam. I froze. The wind wasn't strong enough to move those doors. A few minutes later, I heard that same slow, dragging sound again. Metal on wood, closer, heavier. Then footsteps again, circling. The breathing returned too, louder this time, raspy and uneven. The chair I'd pushed against the door suddenly shifted. I could hear the wood creak under pressure, like something was pushing against it from the other side. I held my breath, gripping my knife tightly, waiting for the latch to break. But it didn't. After what felt like forever, the pressure eased, the breathing stopped, and I heard the slow steps moving away again. I sat there in the dark until dawn, too scared to even blink. When the first light came through the cracks in the wall, I finally packed my bag. My hands were shaking the whole time. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. When I stepped outside, the ground was covered in fresh prints, dozens of them, all leading back toward the barn. I walked to my truck, started it, and didn't look back. As I drove off, I passed the barn one last time. The doors were wide open now, swinging slowly in the wind. Inside, I caught a glimpse of something. A pile of torn fabric, maybe an old coat, and something that looked like a metal chain half buried in the dirt. I didn't stop to check. When I got home later that day, I called my father and told him the farm wasn't safe anymore. A few weeks later, he told me they sent someone to check on it, a local farmhand. The man said the barn had collapsed in a storm not long after I left. He also said there were bones buried under it, old ones, maybe from livestock. But he didn't say much more, and I didn't ask. It's been years since then, but I still remember that breathing, slow, deliberate, too close to my ear even through the wall. I don't know what was out there. Maybe it was just some desperate person living off the land, maybe something else entirely. But I've never gone back, and I never plan to. The farm can rot away out there for all I care. I got what I came for, silence, just not the kind I was expecting. It had been almost 8 years since I last saw my ex-husband, Mark. We divorced in 2017, a messy end that came after years of arguments and silence that lingered like smoke after a fire. He had moved to a remote piece of land deep in northern Idaho after that, built himself a small cabin far from anyone. He said he wanted peace, but I always thought he just wanted to be alone where no one could tell him how much he'd changed. Last winter, I got a call from his sister saying he'd passed away. They said it was a heart attack. Found him in his cabin after a neighbor noticed his truck hadn't moved in days. There wasn't much to settle, but she told me his lawyer wanted me to come look through his things, maybe take what was mine. I didn't want to go, but part of me needed to. Closure, I told myself. Maybe to see for myself that it was really over. Not just the marriage, but everything that came after. So, in late February, I drove 6 hours up from Spokane. The road grew narrower and rougher the further I went. By the time I reached the dirt track leading to his land, the trees were thick enough to blot out the sun. Snow still clung to the ground in patches, hardened and gray. The air felt damp and heavy. My old Subaru creaked as it rolled over the frozen ruts. When I saw the cabin, it was smaller than I remembered from the photos he'd sent years ago. One room, tin roof, a small porch half buried in leaves and debris. The place looked abandoned long before he died. The front steps sagged. The door was slightly off its hinges, and there was a faint smell of mold and would rot even from outside. I parked a few feet away and sat for a minute before getting out. Everything was silent except for the wind slipping through the trees. No birds, no distant hum of traffic, just the soft creak of the tall pines. It felt like the world had shrunk to just me and that cabin. When I finally went inside, it was colder than I expected. The air was dry and still, heavy with the faint smell of old coffee grounds and dust. The floorboards groaned under my boots. There was a wood stove in the corner, a rusted kettle on top, and a pile of logs that looked untouched for months. His bed was unmade, a simple cot pushed against the wall with a threadbare blanket. The table beside it was cluttered with things: a flashlight, a notebook, a cracked mug, a small framed photo of his dog. The lawyer had told me there wasn't much left of value, just personal items, tools, some documents. I went through the drawers, the small shelves, the cabinets. There was nothing remarkable: old receipts, some hunting gear, maps with trails marked in red pen. But there was something strange about how everything was placed. Too orderly. It didn't feel like someone who just lived their day to day. It felt like someone who had been expecting to leave, or maybe knew he wouldn't be back. I found a half-empty pack of cigarettes on the table, though he'd quit years before. That made me pause. I remember him trying to quit when we were together. It was hard for him. He'd go weeks without smoking, then slip up after a fight or a long day. Maybe he'd started again in those last months. Maybe that was how he calmed himself out here all alone. Outside, the daylight was fading. The forest had that dim, bluish light that comes right before dusk, where every shadow stretches longer than it should. I wasn't planning on staying the night, but by the time I finished packing his documents and a few personal things into a box, the sun was already gone behind the trees. The road back would be dangerous in the dark, especially with the ice patches. So I decided to stay just for the night. I set up a small fire in the stove. It took longer than I expected. The wood was damp, the matches old. But after a while, the cabin started to warm up. The walls popped softly as the heat reached into the dry wood. I pulled one of his old blankets over my shoulders and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the flickering light. It was quiet again, too quiet. Even the fire seemed to burn without sound. I could hear every little thing. The faint drip of water somewhere in the sink, the creak of the wood when the wind brushed against the walls, the dull ticking of my wristwatch. I thought about him, how he used to sit like this, probably every night, alone, surrounded by nothing but the woods. Around midnight, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to cut through the silence. A short, metallic clink, like something brushing against the metal latch on the door. I stayed still, listening. Then came another sound, slower this time, like something dragging across the porch. I told myself it was an animal, probably a raccoon, or maybe a branch scraping in the wind. Still, my heartbeat picked up. I sat up and reached for my phone to check the time. 12:47 a.m. The fire had gone down to glowing embers. The light was low and orange, barely pushing back the darkness around the room. Then there was another sound, faint but clear. A soft thud, like a boot step in the snow outside. I froze. The cabin was too isolated for anyone to just be walking by. I hadn't seen another car or person in miles. The nearest neighbor was supposed to be half a mile down the ridge. I held my breath, listening, but the sound didn't come again. Just the wind, faint and hollow. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing. I added a few logs to the stove and sat back, trying not to think about it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there, close enough to touch the door. The next morning, I found footprints in the snow outside the porch. Not mine, these were larger, heavier. There were two distinct tracks leading up to the steps, stopping near the door, then turning back into the woods. The snow around them was disturbed, like whoever it was had stood there for a while. Watching, maybe. It unnerved me. I thought about leaving right then, but curiosity kept me there. I followed the tracks for a few yards before they disappeared into a thicker patch of trees. The forest was quiet, but the kind of quiet that feels like something's listening. I turned back. Inside the cabin, I started packing the rest of the things quickly. Papers, photos, a few tools, just enough to clear what I came for. I was ready to go when I noticed something on the table that hadn't been there the night before. A single cigarette, unlit, lying right next to my keys, stopped me cold. I hadn't smoked in years. I hadn't touched those cigarettes on the table either. My hands felt numb as I picked it up. It was the same brand Mark used to smoke when we were together, red filter, faded packaging. It looked freshly taken from the pack. For a few seconds, I just stood there staring at it. Then I put it down, grabbed the box of things, and walked out without looking back. The drive down that road felt endless. Every bend in the trees looked the same. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway and saw other cars again. Only then did I feel like I could breathe properly. A week later, when I went through the box back home, I found one last thing I hadn't noticed before: his old notebook. Most of it was filled with lists, sketches of trails, weather notes. But on one of the last pages, he had written something in his uneven handwriting. "If anyone finds this, someone's been coming by at night. I don't know who. I thought it was animals at first, but I keep hearing them stop at the porch. Sometimes they knock. I stopped going out after dark. That was the last entry. I sat there for a long time reading that over and over. Maybe it was some stranger, a hunter, a lost traveler. Maybe it was just my nerves or the way isolation warps how you hear things. But I'll never forget how that cigarette looked. Clean, untouched, sitting exactly where I couldn't miss it. I didn't go back to that cabin. His sister sold the land a few months later, and I never asked who bought it. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about how it felt to stand there, in that silence, knowing someone had been watching, just close enough to leave something behind. It was late October of 2017 when I decided to take a few days off and drive out to my old family cabin in northern Montana. I hadn't been there in years, not since my father passed, and honestly, I wasn't planning to go back anytime soon. But work had been wearing me down, and I felt like I needed a quiet place to clear my head. I took my dog, Jasper, a 4-year-old German Shepherd who hated car rides but loved the woods, and packed enough supplies for a week. The cabin sat deep in the forest, about 8 miles off the main road, and I liked that. No phone service, no traffic, just the sound of the wind and the trees. The drive there took almost 12 hours. By the time I reached the dirt trail leading to the cabin, the sun had already dropped behind the mountains, and the sky was turning that pale shade of gray that comes right before darkness. I remember how quiet it felt when I parked the truck. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, it was the heavy kind, where even the air feels like it's listening. Jasper didn't want to jump out of the back seat at first, which was odd for him. Normally, he'd be running around as soon as I opened the door. But that night, he just sat there, ears pulled back, staring into the tree line. I had to call him twice before he finally hopped out. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered. The paint was chipped, the porch steps sagged, and the roof had a dark patch that looked like it might have been from water damage. Still, it felt strange being back there, like stepping into a photograph from another life. I unlocked the door, flicked on the lantern, and was hit by that familiar smell of old wood and dampness. Dust hung in the air, catching the light. Everything was where it used to be. The same old couch, the same kitchen table, even my dad's old boots still tucked near the door. I lit the stove, got a small fire going, and unpacked what I could. Jasper curled up near the fireplace while I made some instant noodles and poured myself a cup of coffee. The silence was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire. I should have felt calm, but I didn't. Every little noise made me look over my shoulder. A branch tapping against the window, the wind pushing against the walls. I told myself it was just the cabin settling, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. Around midnight, Jasper's ears perked up, and he lifted his head, his eyes fixed on the front door. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just stared, tail stiff. I froze, listening, but I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no sound of branches breaking, just that same heavy silence. After a while, Jasper relaxed again, but I couldn't shake the tension that crawled up my neck. I locked the door, even though I knew no one was supposed to be out here. The next morning, I woke up early and stepped outside with my coffee. The air was cold and sharp, the kind that bites at your face. The forest looked beautiful, covered in mist, everything damp and still. I decided to take Jasper for a walk down to the lake about half a mile away. It was something I used to do when I was a kid. The path was still there, though overgrown, and I noticed footprints along the muddy edges, boot prints. Not mine. They looked fresh. I stopped for a second, trying to make sense of it. Maybe some hunter had passed through, I told myself. It wasn't private land technically, even though my family had owned the cabin for decades. But there was something off about the way the prints stopped suddenly halfway down the trail, like the person had just turned around and disappeared. Jasper kept sniffing the air, tail low, moving slower than usual. When we got to the lake, I noticed more signs of someone being there. A crushed beer can, a small pile of ashes where someone had built a fire. It looked recent, no more than a day old. The weird part was that there were no tire marks or signs of a vehicle anywhere near the cabin trail, and the nearest road was miles away. Whoever it was had walked in. I stood there for a while, staring at the still water, feeling that same unease crawl back up my spine. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside, soft, irregular sounds, like footsteps on wet leaves. Every time I got up and looked out the window, there was nothing. Jasper stayed alert, pacing near the door, ears twitching at every sound. I didn't see anything, but I could feel it, that someone was out there, watching. Around 3 in the morning, Jasper started growling. Low, steady, his fur raised along his back. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it out the window. First, I saw nothing but trees. Then the light caught something near the edge of the clearing, the faint shape of a man, standing just far enough to be blurred by the fog. He wasn't moving, just standing there. I froze. My hand shook so hard the light trembled against the glass. I turned it off immediately and waited, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Jasper kept growling until suddenly, the sound of footsteps started fading back into the woods. Slow, deliberate steps crunching over leaves. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I found boot prints again. Fresh ones, circling the cabin this time. Whoever it was had come close. I checked the doors, the windows, all still locked. But the sight of those tracks made my stomach turn. I thought about packing up and leaving, but part of me wanted to know who it was. Maybe a hunter lost in the woods, maybe a drifter. Still, something about it didn't feel random. It felt intentional. By the third day, Jasper wouldn't even go outside. He stayed by the door, restless, watching the windows. That afternoon, I went to check the generator behind the cabin, which had been sputtering all morning. The air was colder that day, and the woods were quiet again. Too quiet. I found cigarette butts on the ground near the generator, still warm. That meant someone had been standing there minutes before I came out. I didn't think twice after that. I went inside, packed everything I could into the truck, and decided to leave before nightfall. The moment I started loading the last bag, I heard something snap in the woods, not far off, maybe 50 feet away. I didn't look. I didn't need to. Jasper was already barking, his eyes locked on that same patch of trees. I threw the last of my gear into the truck, jumped in, and hit the gas. As I drove down the narrow dirt path, I looked into the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of someone stepping out onto the trail behind me. A man, tall, wearing dark clothes. He didn't chase me, he just stood there, watching as I drove away. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road. Even then, I didn't look back again. I drove straight through the night, with Jasper curled up in the passenger seat, his head resting on my leg. When I finally got home, I parked in the driveway and just sat there, breathing, trying to convince myself that what I saw was real. A week later, I got a call from a local sheriff in the area. They had found signs of someone living near the woods close to my family's land. A small makeshift camp, clothes, tools, and an old rifle. The sheriff said they believed it belonged to a man who had been wanted for a series of break-ins across rural Montana. He'd been squatting in abandoned cabins, hiding out for months. I hung up the phone and sat there for a long time. I realized then how close I might have come to something much worse. I sold the cabin 2 months later. Never went back. Even now, sometimes when I walk Jasper in the evening and the wind moves through the trees just right, I catch that same cold feeling again, that sense of being watched. And every time it happens, I see that man in my head, standing in the fog outside my cabin, not moving, not saying a word, just waiting. It had been almost 10 years since I last drove up the dirt road that led to my grandfather's old cabin. The tires of my pickup crushed through the gravel, making a sound that echoed in the silence of the woods. It was late October of 1997, and the air had already started to turn cold. The trees around me were almost bare, with only a few rust-colored leaves hanging onto thin branches. I remember the smell of the pine, the dampness of the forest floor, and how that same road used to feel endless when I was a kid riding in the passenger seat next to my grandfather. He died earlier that year, and I was only now ready to face the place again. The cabin sat at the far end of a lake in northern Montana, about an hour from the nearest small town. My grandfather built it himself in the late 1950s, and for as long as I could remember, it had always looked old and tired. The roof sagged in the middle, and the wooden porch creaked even when no one was standing on it. Still, he loved that place more than anything. He used to spend entire summers there, fishing and fixing things that never stayed fixed. I came along most summers, helping him chop wood or set traps for rabbits. I thought coming back would bring me some sort of peace. Instead, as I parked the truck and cut the engine, I felt something heavy settle in my chest. The air was cold enough to sting. I grabbed my flashlight and backpack, then stepped out. The wind carried the faint smell of wet soil and the old lake water. It was quiet, too quiet. Even the birds were gone for the season. My boots sank a little in the soft dirt as I walked toward the cabin. The door was still the same one I remembered, scratched and splintered, with the handle barely hanging on. When I pushed it open, it groaned like it was waking from a long sleep. The smell hit me right away, musty, thick, and old. The air inside hadn't moved in years. The cabin looked frozen in time. The small table near the window was still covered with a faded checkered cloth. An empty coffee mug sat on the counter, stained brown. There were boots by the door, his boots, and a wool jacket hanging from a hook. Everything was coated with a thin layer of dust. The last time I was there, my grandfather had been sitting in that same chair by the fireplace, sharpening his knife. Now it was just a chair, empty, leaning slightly to one side. I set my backpack down on the floor and walked around slowly. Every step I took stirred up dust. The boards creaked under my weight, dry and brittle. I went into the small bedroom at the back, the one where I used to sleep. The bed was still there, the mattress sagging, and the blanket folded neatly on top. A photograph of my grandmother, who died long before I was born, sat on the nightstand. The frame had a crack running across the glass. I stayed there for a few minutes, just looking at everything, remembering how things used to be. Then I noticed something strange. The air inside the cabin smelled different in one corner, stronger, sour almost. It came from near the back door that led down to the small storage cellar beneath the cabin. That cellar had always made me uneasy, even when I was little. My grandfather kept tools and some old hunting gear down there, but he rarely let me go inside. I went closer to the trapdoor and noticed that it was slightly open, just a crack, enough for the smell to seep through. My stomach tightened. I knelt down and lifted it the rest of the way. The rusty hinges squealed. Cold air rose from below, carrying a sharp, foul scent. I shone my flashlight down the wooden steps. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a dirt floor, a few old shelves, and something else, something lying near the far wall. At first, I thought it was just an old tarp or some pile of clothes. But when I stepped down the creaky steps and got closer, the shape became clear. It was a body. I froze halfway between a breath, staring at it. The clothes were faded flannel and jeans, clothes my grandfather always wore. The skin, what little I could see of it, was gray and tight. His face was partly covered by the brim of his old cap. My flashlight trembled in my hand. I stood there for a long time, not believing what I was seeing. My mind tried to explain it in a dozen ways. Maybe it was a dummy, maybe someone else, maybe it was just something that looked like him. But deep down I knew It was him. I knelt beside him slowly, my hands shaking. The dirt around the body was hard and dry, like it had been undisturbed for months, maybe longer. His boots were still on, and his fingers were stiff, curled near his chest. A rusted lantern sat a few feet away, tipped on its side. I noticed a metal pipe running from the corner of the cellar to an old generator I hadn't seen in years. It looked like it had been rigged together from spare parts. The realization hit me slowly. The generator wasn't for power, it had been for heat. My grandfather must have tried to keep warm one winter using that old setup. The pipe wasn't vented properly. It led nowhere. Carbon monoxide. It explained everything. The way he was lying, the position of his hands, the fact that there was no sign of struggle. He must have gone down there to work on something, started the generator, and fallen asleep, not realizing what was happening. I sat down on the cold dirt floor next to him, trying to understand how no one ever found him. He'd been missing for almost 2 years before we all assumed he'd wandered off into the woods and never came back. Search parties had combed the area for weeks. No one thought to check under the cabin. The air in the cellar was thick and heavy. My head started to ache from the smell of decay and the lack of fresh air. I knew I had to get out. I climbed back up and pushed the trapdoor shut. My hands were trembling so badly that I dropped the flashlight twice. When I finally stepped outside, the daylight felt harsh against my eyes. I stood there for a long while, breathing deeply, letting the cold wind cut through the fog in my head. I didn't go back inside right away. I walked down to the edge of the lake instead. The surface of the water was calm, still reflecting the gray sky. I could almost picture him there, standing at the dock, casting his line out like he used to. It felt wrong, him being gone in that quiet, lonely way. Eventually, I went back, found a tarp in the shed, and covered the trapdoor. I couldn't bring myself to move him or even call anyone right away. The whole thing felt like it needed a moment, like disturbing it too fast would be disrespectful somehow. I sat on the porch as the sun started to set, the cold air biting at my fingers. The forest around me was silent again, except for the sound of the wind pushing through the dry grass. When I finally drove back to town that night, I stopped at the sheriff's office and told them everything. They came out the next morning with a coroner and a couple of deputies. I followed them back to the cabin. They went down into the cellar, and after a while, they brought him out in a body bag. They told me what I already knew, that it looked like an accident, a slow, quiet death caused by carbon monoxide. The sheriff said it was likely he'd fallen asleep before he ever knew what hit him. Standing there, watching them load his body into the van, I felt something settle in me, a mix of sadness and relief. Sadness because of how alone he must have been. Relief because I finally knew what happened to him. For years we'd wondered if he'd gotten lost, or worse, if someone had hurt him. But now I knew. It was simple, tragic, and painfully human. Before leaving, I walked around the cabin one last time. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees. I noticed the faint marks of his old footprints still pressed into the dirt near the cellar door, frozen there in time. I stood there until the cold made my hands numb. That was the last time I ever went back. The cabin still stands there by the lake, probably falling apart now, but I never wanted to see it again. Every time I think about it, I picture him down in that cellar, still and quiet, as the world went on without him. There was no mystery left, no haunting, just a man who made one mistake in a place he loved too much to leave. And for some reason, that truth, the quiet, ordinary way it ended, was scarier than anything else. I still remember that cabin like it's burned into my mind. It sat deep in the woods of northern Montana, far past where cell service cut out and the road turned to broken dirt. It wasn't much to look at, just a small wooden place built in the 70s. with peeling brown paint and a metal roof that clattered whenever the wind hit it. It had been my uncle's hunting cabin, but he'd passed away years ago, and no one had really used it since. I was 31 when I decided to go up there alone for a week. I told myself it was to clear my head, get away from work, maybe do some fishing. But I think, deep down, I wanted to test myself, see how I'd handle complete isolation. I drove up there in late October, right before the snow started to fall heavy. The drive itself felt endless. The deeper I went, the thinner the road became, until it was just a narrow strip surrounded by tall pines that blocked out most of the sky. When I finally reached the turnoff, it was marked by a rusted sign that barely had any paint left on it. I drove down that uneven path for another half hour before I saw the cabin come into view. It looked smaller than I remembered. The steps creaked under my boots when I carried my things inside. The air inside had that dry, musty smell that comes from a place being shut for too long, with dust, mildew, and something faintly metallic like rust. There were still old beer cans and faded magazines from the 90s on a table in the corner. I spent most of that first day cleaning, sweeping out cobwebs, wiping down surfaces, and unpacking my supplies. I had canned food, bottled water, a small generator for power, and my dog, Max. He was a big mixed breed, quiet and calm most of the time, but he had a sharp sense for anything unusual. I trusted his instincts more than my own. That first night, I barely slept. The silence was heavier than I'd expected. Out there, the smallest sound felt amplified. The creak of wood, the wind slipping through the cracks, even Max shifting on the floor made my pulse quicken. I wasn't scared yet, not really, but there was something about being that far from everything that made you aware of how small you were. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up at every noise. The next morning, I went to the lake a few miles from the cabin. The water was freezing cold, and mist hung low over it like a blanket. I fished for a while, caught nothing, and just sat there listening to the quiet. Around noon, I thought I heard what sounded like an engine far off in the distance, maybe another vehicle on the old logging road, but it faded quickly. Still, it made me uneasy. That road was barely used. If someone else was up here, I wanted to know why. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed footprints near the porch. They were fresh, pressed deep into the damp dirt, and definitely not mine. They looked like boot prints larger than my own. I tried to tell myself they were old or maybe from a hiker who had passed through before me, but they were too clear for that. Max sniffed them and let out a low, short growl, his ears stiff. I didn't like that. I checked the area around the cabin, but didn't find anything else. No tire marks, no trash, nothing out of place. Still, it bothered me. That night, I locked the doors, double-checked the windows, and sat up for a while reading by lantern light. Around midnight, Max's head shot up. He stared toward the window, ears twitching. I couldn't hear anything at first, but after a few seconds, I caught it, a faint crunching sound. Footsteps, slow and steady, circling the cabin. I froze. The lantern flickered, and I turned it down low. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. I waited, listening. The steps stopped for a moment, then continued on the far side of the cabin, closer to the back door. I stayed perfectly still. Max was rigid beside me, his body trembling slightly but silent. After maybe 2 minutes, the sounds stopped completely. I didn't move for a long time after that. Eventually, I turned off the lantern and sat there in the dark, waiting. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I found more prints, fresh ones, around the back of the cabin. Whoever it was had been close enough to the door that I could see the dirt pushed up against the wood where they'd stood. I thought about leaving, but the road was rough, and I didn't want to risk getting stuck. I told myself maybe it was a hunter, or someone camping nearby who got turned around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I spent that day keeping busy, chopping wood, fixing a loose window frame, anything to distract myself. I even walked a few hundred feet into the woods to check for signs of anyone else, but the trees grew thick fast, and I didn't want to wander too far. I came back before sunset, made dinner, and tried to act normal. But I noticed Max wouldn't stop pacing near the window. Every few minutes, he'd stop, stare into the trees, and then move again. That night, the noises came back. This time, it was more than footsteps. I heard something metallic scraping lightly, like a knife brushing against wood. Came from near the door. My whole body tensed. I sat there, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. After a long minute, it stopped. Then, silence again. So quiet I could hear my heartbeat. At dawn, I went outside with the axe in my hand. The door frame had a small mark on it. A thin scratch, fresh enough that the wood was still pale underneath. Someone had tried to pry the latch. That was enough for me. I decided to leave that morning. I packed fast, loaded everything into the truck, and got Max inside. As I started driving down the dirt path, I saw something in the distance. A small pile of rocks near the edge of the trees. It wasn't there before. On top of the pile was a piece of fabric, torn and dirty, flapping slightly in the wind. I didn't stop to look closer. The drive out felt even longer. The forest seemed endless. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see another car or someone following me. But the road behind stayed empty. When I finally reached the highway, I pulled over, stepped out, and just stood there for a while, letting the noise of passing trucks and the hum of civilization calm me down. It felt like coming back to a different world. Later, when I told the local sheriff what happened, he said a few cabins up in that area had been broken into over the past year, mostly by squatters or people hiding out from the law. They'd found one abandoned truck near the trails months back. No driver, no ID, just a shotgun in the back seat. He told me it was probably nothing, but I could tell by the way he said it that he didn't really believe that. I never went back to that cabin. My uncle's land was sold not long after. Sometimes, though, when I drive through quiet wooded areas, I still catch that same uneasy feeling. The sound of branches snapping, the faint crunch of footsteps in dirt, it all comes back. I think about the scratch marks on the door and the footprints circling the cabin, and I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't woken up that night. Whoever it was, they weren't lost. They knew exactly where I was, and that's what still keeps me up sometimes. Not knowing who was out there, watching from the trees, waiting for me to fall asleep.